All right, like you said, I kind of came to this sort of second career thing. Went to college, figured I'd go home, get out of the Army, be a construction project manager like my dad was, and didn't work out the way. Spent 25 years in the Army, and one of the things that I got to do there was work on a project called Whole Soldier that dealt with answering the question, how do you measure soldier performance? What is a quality soldier? Things like that. And we've been battling the Army bureaucracy for about a decade on getting them to actually implement it, but I think we're about there. Variants of it have been used in programs for surgical residents at the Mayo Clinic, for New York City police officers at the NYPD. So I think we're onto something. But this is kind of how I got into sports, believe it or not. So, I mean, look at me, I'm not a sports, I'm a recreational volleyball and tennis player. I'm definitely not a basketball player. But when I was teaching at West Point, I found out that students react well to statistics and optimization models and things like that when they're in a context that they care about. And what I found out was sports. So when I retired from the Army, came to Notre Dame, and they said, hey, would you like to develop and teach a sports analytics course? I said, where do I sign? So I've been doing that now for, well, this will be the third year, and it's gone pretty well. This work is some work that this year with the NIT tournament, the school I currently follow. I have a few others I follow. I went to Lehigh as an undergrad, taught at Army, went to Maryland for a PhD, so I'm a Terp. So I follow them for basketball, but now I follow, of course, the Irish as well. And the Irish ended up in the NIT, which wasn't something that typically I found myself watching in earlier years. By the way, how many postseason basketball tournaments are there in the NCAA? 4, correct. Okay. Not everyone knows that, so well, now y'all do, just making sure. How many Division I basketball teams are there? 351. 351. What percentage of them go to one of those 4 tournaments? Take a guess. It's a little more than a third. 38% actually. So 68 go to the big dance, 32 play in the NIT, 16 in the CBI, and 20 in the College Insider Tournament. And generally speaking, and this is, you can't say this is true for all teams, but generally speaking, the field in the NCAA tournament is stronger than the NIT, which is stronger than CBI, which is stronger than CI. And I'll look at a few visualizations of that, or show you a couple that I've built, just to see if that does indeed hold true. Because as we think about what the NCAA is doing here with some of these experimental rules in the NIT, maybe we somehow have to account for that factor. So about these experimental rules, they've done this 3 out of the past 4 years. As I understand it, the NCAA has a 2-year kind of rule review cycle that they go through. They test some things out, see what works, and they've done this 3 out of the past 4 years. This year in the NIT, which is the kind of the second-tier tournament, if you will, and I think one of the reasons they do that, and again, I've not talked with anyone at the NCAA on this, but is, well, it's kind of the middle-of-the-road tournament. They have a tournament that's higher, a couple that are lower. They can kind of see. You can't necessarily attribute it just to say skill or something. But the 4 changes they made this year were they pushed the 3-point line back to the international standard by 20 inches. They widened the lane to the NBA width. They split the halves into quarters with resetting foul shots and doing away with the 1-and-1, and then resetting the shot clock to 20 seconds instead of 30 after an offensive rebound, with the thought being, you don't need time to bring the ball down the court. So these are the 4 rules. If we look at them visually, just to make sure everybody's clear, I think everybody understands what the basketball court looks like, but pushing back this line, what changes might you think this would make in performance, in outcomes of games, in scoring, in anything? Somebody give me an idea or two. What's that? Lower score overall. Why?
More difficult to do the high percentage.
Okay, more difficult to shoot a 3 from 20 inches further back. Okay, that's reasonable. Any other differences?
It would be more space to drive, so it'd be more layups.
Okay, so more space to drive, more layups, which kind of goes against maybe the lower score in a way, understanding that a 3 is worth more than a 2, but it isn't just purely in one direction. I think that's one of the things that that I want to point out, is that not just do these rules sometimes pull in different directions, but an individual rule by itself also can pull in more than one direction. I think that's important to think about. Okay, rule change 2, widening the lane from 12 to 16 feet. What changes might we expect here?
You might see more like lane violations or like 3-second violations with defenses because there's more space now that you have to occupy.
Okay, so more lane violations. Anyone want to take a guess at how many lane violations there were in more than 5,000 Division I college basketball games this year? How many total in over 5,000 games? 59. I'll show you. Yeah, the rate of lane violations went up in the NIT, but there were only 2 lane violations called in the NIT. So I'm not sure that I'm willing to base a whole lot on that. I don't know that we're going to get much out of the data on this one, to be honest. Okay, rule change 3, changing the duration of or changing from a half to a quarter. So currently we've got a 20-minute half, which if you think about it, at the minimum, if no coach calls a timeout, which our previous speaker said he'd be okay with, you've still got the 4 timeouts here that are roughly 2 minutes, sometimes 2.5, depends how long it takes the teams to get reset, all that. But if you think about it, it takes a minimum of 28 minutes. Under the splitting it from 20 minutes into 2 10-minute quarters and going to only 1 timeout in there and then essentially a timeout in between the quarter, it does shorten the time. And I believe one of the things the NCAA is concerned about is the length of the game growing and how can they keep it a little bit shorter. So maybe we'd see something here. The data that I have to present today does not get at this at all. I have actually recently, through our library at the university, actually through the film, television, and theater department, found out that there is such data as when does a broadcast, when does a game tip off and when does it end, that's provided to the NCAA. Getting them to share the data has been a little bit tricky, but I think we've worked through that. I mean, we can always find when our game's supposed to start, and they usually start pretty close to on time, but not always. The hard part's finding when do they end. And going back historically to see, has it changed the actual length of games or not? One of the other things that kind of complicates that, though, is in postseason play, they tend to make half times longer. They tend to be a little more lenient with some of the timeout lengths. And so I don't know that I'm going to get there, but anyway, just something to be aware of. The other piece of rule change, or Rule 3 change, though, is why I have Rule Change 3. About 45 minutes ago, I went to make one minor change to my presentation. By the way, this has all been generated out of our studio using our Markdown. That's what all the analysis was done in, and you'll see some R code here in a minute. Now this part wasn't. This was like an image that I made in PowerPoint and exported and whatnot. But I went to make one minor change, and I botched something up, and it took me a little while to recover my presentation. But I think we're there. But notice, typically when you get to 7 fouls, you shoot 1 and 1. When you get to 10, the double bonus, you shoot 2. Whereas now in each of these 10-minute quarters, since they're resetting it here, you get to 5, you shoot 2. So they're doing away with that. What changes might you expect that to make? What do we think? Are we going to see more or less fouls as a result of this? More or less free throws attempted as a result of this? Any initial reactions? Not sure?
I'd say more free throws.
You think more free throws? Because you only got to get to 5 per quarter rather than 7 or 10, and you don't always get the second one here. Yeah, maybe. We'll see. Okay, so like I said, this was all done in our studio. By the way, how many R coders do we have out here? I'm just trying to get a sense. Okay, fair number. So I'm an old R coder. I started using S+ back in the late 90s, which was the commercial version of S that preceded R. And then I switched over to R in the early 2000s. Part of the issue, though, is I learned it using the old-fashioned version pre-tidyverse days. I'm still in the process of converting over, so you may see a mix of oldish and newish code. If you see something you don't know what it's doing, I mean, we're not here to talk code, but if you want to ask afterward, I'm happy to explain. But anyway, I want to point out that I am using a bunch of the packages from the tidyverse. I used RVest to do some web scraping. Lubridate helps with dates and times. A fuzzy joining thing I find is useful because, especially in some of the text fields, people don't exactly always type what they mean to type or what you would expect them to type. There's a forcats package to help with factors and categorical variables, and I've been playing around a little bit with these joy or ridge plots recently instead of comparative box plots, just to see how they differ. And I'm going to ask y'all which you prefer here at some point. So I loaded the packages, and then I get the data. By the way, anybody familiar with NatStat? It's a subscription-based service. They have baseball data, basketball data, and I believe they've just added hockey. The academic price was pretty reasonable, and it's in good shape as opposed to going out and getting data in lots of places and pulling it together. So as you see here, I downloaded a whole bunch of CSVs basically on April 4th after the postseason tournaments had all ended, after the championship in the NCAA. By the way, when you're reading in from CSV files, if you can guess or provide a guess at how many rows you believe there are, it tends to help with that. It's an optional parameter, but if you haven't ever seen that, it can be useful. So we got to get the data in. So I've now got a bunch of R data frames here that I can do something with. And one of the things I have to figure out is, well, who are the teams that are in each of these tournaments? So I went out and used the Wikipedia pages on this. And interestingly, the Wikipedia pages, you may see that the method that we used here for the NCAA tournament versus the NIT tournament versus the other two that are on the next slide are not all the same. So even like on Wikipedia, you know, you might think, hey, these are all the postseason tournaments from one year. They would all be sort of in the same format. No, not necessarily. So just be aware you may have to do things a little bit differently. Pull in the teams from the CBI and College Insider tournaments. Notice we had to actually use a little bit of, had to put in a GSO code here and do some regular expression matching because things just aren't always as you might expect them to be. And the other thing I decided to do was pull the RPI ratings, and we can argue whether it's a perfect, imperfect, well, it's definitely not perfect, but we can argue about how good or bad of a measure it is to compare strength of a team. I think it's reasonable, though, to kind of consider it for comparing these tournaments. So then what? Well, you have to do a bunch of data cleaning because Division I teams play non-Division I teams. You have to pull those games out because clearly they aren't going to end up in any of the tournaments. Had to find a bunch of teams that don't match, the way they are in the data I have versus in Wikipedia. Things don't necessarily match. So wrote a bunch of code to figure out using the fuzzy join there to figure out which ones don't match. And then I essentially had to clean them all up. You can see the types of schools that tend to have string naming issues. And these tend to come up again and again. Once you've done this a time or two, you kind of know which ones are causing the problem. The one that's the worst, to be honest, is some data. You'll notice this here says Loyola.Chicago. There are hyphens that aren't really hyphens. But anyway, some cleaning required. And then what? Well, then I said, okay, well, let's split this data up in a number of ways. One thing was I actually started this analysis like halfway through the tournaments because I was thinking about it. And one of the things I had to do was some of the pages actually had games that were scheduled in the next few days in the data, but yet there wasn't any scores, there wasn't any, no box score, anything. So I had to filter based on past games. Once I got to the end of the season, it didn't really matter. I left it there, though, so that I could reuse it again next year. Then I had to split it based on the date, when was the end of the regular season, the start of the tournament, because knowing whether a game was a regular season game versus a tournament game seemed important, and then splitting all the tournament games into which tournament seemed important. This is all fairly standard, just kind of filtering. Pretty easy to go. We did a little bit of checking just to make sure that everything added up, that we had the right number of tournament games, 134 across the 4 tournaments. Right number in each of the tournaments, all good. By the way, the CBI is a little bit different. The final is a best of 3 versus the other tournaments that are just, a single championship game. That threw me for a loop at first, but I couldn't figure out where these other 2 games coming from. So they may play all 3, or they might only play 2, depending how it goes. So then one of the things I had to do was kind of join which tournament did a team end up in. So I built a joiner tool here to do that, and I ended up using the team ID, which is the numeric ID. I thought that was the easiest way to do it, and it was for some of the data, but I had to go back and actually do it on names for others. And so part of this might just be my lack of skill in R, because I'm a little rusty. I haven't used it in a while. So anyway, I pulled in the data and I said, okay, well, is the NCAA the strongest tournament on average? So if I look here, the mean RPI for the NCAA is 0.586, NIT 0.553, CBI 0.499, CI 0.492, and for teams that don't make any of the tournaments, 0.467 on average. Yeah, it kind of comes out the way I would expect it to. Interestingly, the NCAA actually has more variability than any of the other tournaments. So there it is, tabular, but you know, we're humans, we like pictures. So this is the traditional way I would have visualized this with a comparative box plot. Pretty much what I just said on average, you know, NCAA is stronger than NIT and so forth. But it was really interesting to see this, which though, what's going on down here? You all know, the automatic bids from winning some of the conferences that aren't so strong that end up as in a playing game or as a 16 seed, right? And of course, lots of variability in the ones that don't make tournament. So here it is shown as a ridge plot. If you haven't seen these, they've also been called joy plots. They're sort of density plots that are overlapped as opposed to the box plot approach there. I don't know if, I'm not sure if I like it better if it conveys information that the box plots don't. And here I've got the median and the kind of the interquartile range shown as well. Just be aware that that's something that's out there now that's fairly new. That I think I like it, but I'm not sure. Open to thoughts. Okay, so now what? Now I realize, I have to add a season part. Is it regular season or is it, postseason? I mean, I had split it based on dates, but I actually don't just need them in separate data sets. I actually need it back in the one big table, and I need that as one of the fields. And then the other thing I need is, what tournament did a team eventually end up in or none. So a bunch of code to do all of that stuff. So then we started doing some preliminary analysis. Anybody familiar with Morey points? Morey points? Okay, well, what's Daryl Morey's philosophy on where do you shoot from? Three-pointer or kind of inside the restricted arc, right? Within about 5 feet. Well, that's what a Morey point gets you credit for here. And one of the things we looked at is how did Morey points change? In particular for the NIT, how did it change? We notice here in the regular season games, teams that went to the NIT scored 41 Morey points per game. In the tournament, it dropped to 35, so we did see a decrease in either threes or really close, whereas in the NCAA, in the regular season and the tournament, it was pretty close. So there's one potential indicator that there's something going on with pushing that arc back. I forget why we threw dunks in. I think one of my students wanted to know from an excitement factor if it made any difference or not. Lane violations, like I say here, for the NIT and the tournament, notice the rate here, 0.03 is, double or triple any of the other ones, but like I say, there's only 2 of them there. There's only 59 total there. I don't think there's anything there. And then one of the other things we started looking at were, how much time was left on the shot clock. Those numbers don't look right. I'm going to skip that. Okay, so we talked about points earlier. So let's do a scatter plot of score for the home, score for the visitor. And we look at this, and it shouldn't surprise us that most of the dots we see are purple from the regular season. And most of the extreme, very high-scoring games, very low-scoring games happened in the regular season. Let's just focus in on the postseason tournaments. And what do we see here? Well, it appears to me that the NIT has more high-scoring games up here and relatively low, number of low-scoring games. The NCAA, on the other hand, appears to be, maybe this way, that way a little bit, and realizing that home and visitor doesn't really mean a whole lot in the tournament, since hopefully they're mostly playing at neutral sites. But anyway, just trying to see if there's anything there. Of course, part of that might be relative to who are they playing against and the difference in the level of the competition, and how do you account for that. What about pace, possessions? What changed here? So let's see. NCAA teams in the regular season, 68.5 possessions. In the tournament, dropped by about 1.5, 66.8. The NIT, interestingly, in the regular season, 67.9. It actually went up by about 1 in the tournament. Not huge, but it's going in the opposite direction. College Insider also went up, and CBI also went up. So the NCAA was the only one that went down, the other three all went up in terms of possessions. What about three-point shots? Looking at, and this is part of the presentation I botched. I had some graphs here. Sorry you have to look at tables, but the graphs are not showing up right now. Managed to mess that up earlier this morning. But if we look at it, these are sorted in decreasing order for the average three-point percentage. In the NCAA tournament, they're shooting 36 versus in the NCAA tournament, they're shooting 32 versus 36 in the regular season. Now, granted, they're playing much tougher teams here than they do on average there.
The arenas are really different too, right?
Well, yeah, they tend to be much larger except for a few schools. And whereas the NIT, we also saw a drop, but not by as much as for the NCAA. So, there's something else there's something else going on here, and what you mentioned might be part of it, as opposed to just the arc being back 20 inches further. In terms of how many did they attempt, looking to see did they take more or less. In the regular season, NIT teams took 21.2. They actually took slightly more, which maybe was a little counterintuitive for me. Whereas in the NCAA, it was pretty much spot on, in terms of numbers attempted. Free throws. Thinking, the number of fouls might have changed. What do we see in free throws? Well, let's see. NCAA. Free throw attempted in the regular season, 20.3, dropping to 18.8. The NIT in the regular season, 19.6, dropping to 17.9. Again, we're still seeing a drop, but again, not really sure what to make of it. Wait, I missed one. Thought I missed one. Okay, something's not showing up here. We're going to go back into, give me 1 second. It's going to go back into our studio here. And, one of the questions that we had was, common error in our studio. There we go. If we look at this, one of the things that we started thinking about was, well, how can we adjust for the fact that they're playing stronger teams in the tournament than they play in the regular season? So, for example, with possessions, we decided to create this adjusted possessions where we said, what if we were to take, the actual number of possessions, the average, and then scale it by this ratio here of, the opponent RPI, how do we do this here? We're still wrestling with this. How do you account for the fact that they're playing stronger teams in the tournament, and how do you pull that out so that you can really focus on what are the rule changes getting? Don't know that it's right. Still playing with it. Not as far along on this as I'd like with preparing 2 summer classes and all, but I don't know, I just thought it was an interesting data set to take a look at, share with y'all, and like I said on the final slide over here, I welcome your comments, your suggestions, either by email, that's me on Twitter, or here at the conference. So thank you for your attention.
We'll take a few questions.
Any questions?
Well, I had one, but I didn't think I'd get it in, and I forgot it.
Were you expecting the possession change to increase with the shot clock?
I thought it
time
might
going
go
down?
up a little bit, but, 10 seconds on an offensive rebound. How many offensive rebounds do you get in a game typically? Anybody know? I don't know off the top of my head. 15, 12 maybe, I don't know.
Total, half dozen per each team.
Yeah, something like that, maybe 12 or 14 total. So, you know, in theory, it could have, but yeah, didn't really see a whole lot of a change there. But then again, you know, a team doesn't use all of 30 seconds all of the time anyway, you know, a lot of the time. So maybe not by as much as you might have thought.
Does the NCAA, will they come out with their own numbers on what you've done, or?
I don't know. I've wanted to get a little further along than where we are and then reach out to them and say, you know, hey, we've seen you make changes to rules in the past. You know, like some of the younger folks in the audience may not be aware that the shot clock didn't always used to be 30 seconds, even though it may have been in your recent memories. You know, it's been longer than that. They made that change. What other changes have we seen? We've seen, you know, they've made other changes. The question is, if they're going to experiment with rules like this, one would hope they're doing these sorts of analyses, and it might be interesting to see what they do and partner with them, yeah.
Did you mention, was this the first year that they've experimented with these rules, and then they're going to go ahead and do it again next year, 2-year review?
So some of them they had done in 2017 as well, but slightly different. They did the fouls change, but not the quarters bit. They somehow did away with 1-and-1 in 2017, or they reset it. They reset it at 10 minutes, even though there wasn't really a quarter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was
played a 20-minute
bizarre.
half.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So they've sort of done some of them for 2 years. I think the cycle is 18-19. I think that the decisions and any rule changes will come out in 19 is the cycle that we're on. Yeah.
Did you do a score difference to try to isolate that it was a more difficult game or more difficult opponent as a factor? Just a thought.
That's part of what, yeah, not yet, but that's one of the things we're trying to figure out or working on how to do it. Open to suggestions if you want to talk about it. Okay, thank you.